Greetings, this is Greg. This is part 3 of the Fw-190 series, and we're going to take a look at the aerodynamic drag of the plane and specifically the cowling and cooling arrangements. When the Fw-190 first flew in 1939, radial engine land-based fighters were not the norm. The prevailing thinking, especially in Europe, was that the narrow frontal area of a liquid-cooled V-12 provided an insurmountable aerodynamic advantage over the air-cooled radials. It wasn't always this way. Up until the late 1920s, air-cooled and liquid-cooled airplanes were pretty darn close in terms of performance. The advantage sort of flip-flop over the years. In these earlier days of aviation, the extra cooling drag of the radiators just about offset the reduced frontal area of the engine. Liquid-cooled airplanes either had to go with really big cowlings for the big radiators, or they used a streamlined cowling and a remotely mounted radiator. When ethylene glycol became commonly available in the mid-1920s, it was a game changer. A mixture of glycol and water, which is very similar to what's in the cooling systems of modern automobiles, offers the ability to use a smaller heat transfer area, in other words, a smaller radiator as compared with water alone. This reduction in radiator size is very apparent in this picture. As glycol became available, air-cooled radials fell from favor and serious work started on supercharged liquid-cooled V-12s in the late 1920s and early 1930s. These developed into the V-12s we all know from the World War II era: the Allison V-12, Daimler-Benz DB601, Rolls-Royce Merlin, and the Hispano-Suiza 12Y. The Hispano was built under license and powered a large percentage of the Soviet Air Force. All of these engines first ran between 1930 and 1935 and powered the vast majority of fighters that fought in the European theater during the early part of the Second World War. Focke-Wulf had submitted several designs in the 1930s with liquid-cooled V-12s, but didn't get any interest from Germany's Ministry of Aviation until a design was submitted with an air-cooled radial engine. The radial offered obvious logistical advantages because it wouldn't rob any Daimler-Benz engines from production of other aircraft. At this point, work began on what would become the Fw-190. The obvious problem at this point was how the lead designer, Kurt Tank, and his team could get enough speed out of a radial engine fighter to be competitive with the current crop of fast V-12 powered aircraft. This was a challenging problem, but not an insurmountable one. In the first place, radial engines had been making big strides during the 1930s. The new double-row radials with 2 rows of cylinders allowed a large amount of displacement and thus power without a corresponding increase in frontal area. BMW had been developing a 14-cylinder radial using 2 rows of 7 cylinders each. The variant that made it into production, the Fw-190A1 and subsequent A models, had a big BMW 801 engine. It displaced 2560 cubic inches, 2,560, that's 41.8 liters, put out 1,540 horsepower. This was one of the largest and most powerful engines in the world at the time, and certainly in the European theater. Horsepower is important in a fighter, it's very important, but aerodynamics also have a large effect on the plane's top speed, and this is where radial engines tended to fall short. Kurt Tank had some ideas on this subject. While the liquid-cooled engines do have an obvious advantage with less frontal area, what's less obvious is all the extra drag from radiators, oil coolers, charge coolers, and supercharger intake scoops. Of course, the air-cooled engines would also have some of those things, but none would have radiators for engine cooling, and those are a big factor in aircraft drag. It should be pointed out that some cooling drag from a radiator can be recovered via the Meredith effect, but as I've already discussed this in another video about the P51 versus BF109 drag, I'm leaving the Meredith effect out of this video. As an example, take a look at the Spitfire Mark IX. It has 3 big scoops underneath, 1 under the nose for the carb/supercharger air intake, and 2 under the wings, which combine radiator, oil, and charge cooling. For comparison, let's look at an Fw-190A8. While the nose is fairly blunt, it lacks any scoops for the radiators because, of course, being air-cooled, it doesn't have any. It does have an oil cooler and an air intake for the Supercharger, but those are inside the cowling. The 190 also has less wing area, a partially retractable tail wheel, and a steeply sloped armored windscreen angled at 22 degrees compared with 35 degrees for the Spitfire. Which plane do you think has less total drag? It's a good question, and the answer is surprising. In an EAA article titled World War II Fighter Aerodynamics, and I can't put it on screen because I'm pretty sure it's copyrighted, but in that article it's claimed that the total drag of the 190A8 is lower than the Spitfire Mark IX. Could that be right? I think so, and later in the video we will do our own calculations for ourselves to see. I need to point out that this EAA article is not written by some hack, otherwise I wouldn't be mentioning it. It's written by David Lednicer, who is a big deal in aerodynamics. He works in the field professionally, knows far more on this subject than I do. He evaluated this based on things like coefficients of drag, wetted areas, pressure distribution, boundary layer transitions, and so on. In other words, he did his calculations as a designer would do them. That's totally different from the way I'll be doing it later in the video. By the way, Lednicer has a great Korean War fighter video. I'll link it in the description. It has all you'll ever want to know about the F-86's wing. Anyhow, moving on. Let's take a look at that cowling. The initial idea was to use a super tight fitting cowling with a very small opening for cooling air and use a fan to aid in the cooling. This didn't really work, and portions of the design were abandoned, but the overall principle of using a big fan remained. Next, they went to this layout, which is essentially what we see on the production airplanes. It's still closely cowled. The front has been opened up quite a bit for more cooling air. A fan is still used. It's visible just behind the propeller. It spins faster than the prop and creates a high-pressure area behind it. This relatively high-pressure air is used for cooling the engine itself, cooling the oil cooler, and for feeding air into the supercharger. Take a look at this picture. Do you see this small gap? It's present on air-cooled Fw-190s, and it's there for an important reason. This is where cooling air is expelled after it leaves the oil cooler. This oil cooler is in a ring shape. It goes around the front of the cowling. You can see it in this image from the BMW factory manual. Note that in some documentation it shows it as one ring, and some documentation mentions that it's two segmented rings. I'm not sure if that's due to production variations or perhaps the two segments fit so closely together that functionally they're one oil cooler. There's a little bit of mystery there. However, here's how it works. Air comes in through the front of the cowling and is under pressure because of the fan at low speed and of course at high speed because of ram air pressure. The pressure in the cowling is greater than the relatively low pressure outside the cowling at that gap we talked about. Thus, high pressure air reverses direction and it passes through the oil cooler and exits via that gap. I put arrows here to show the path. Green is air going into the cooler, red is for the air exiting the cooler. Keep in mind the inlet and exit is around the entire perimeter of the cooler, not just where I drew the lines. This oil cooler is protected from the front by an armored ring. This picture is from the 190A5 pilot's manual. With this configuration, the extra drag from the 190's oil cooler is negligible. This is in contrast with nearly every other World War II fighter. We have to ask, though, is it worth it? That fan turns pretty fast, 3.17 times faster than the propeller in most variants, and takes as much as 100 horsepower to drive it. Some sources say about 70 horsepower, but I'm going with 100. That 100 horsepower loss is equal to about 94 pounds of drag at the Fw-190A5's top speed at sea level. I doubt a well-designed oil cooler would cause that much drag. But, according to an article in Flight by F.C. Sheffield in 1942, in regards to the aircraft's top speed, the power loss from that fan is a moot point anyway. He says that above 170 miles per hour, the horsepower draw from the fan becomes negligible. Thus, this oil cooler and fan design become a net benefit in terms of top speed. Of course, at lower speeds, it's going to be a net loss, no question about that. There are always trade-offs with this kind of stuff. It's a good time to point out that Focke-Wulf put an armored ring in front of the oil cooler. This arrangement made that possible, and an armored oil cooler was very unusual in World War II fighters, so I think that's an extra benefit of this design. Of course, that armor isn't indestructible. 50 caliber fire at a right angle will punch right through it, certainly at ranges under 500 meters. Also, bullets can enter the cowling and ricochet back and damage the oil coolers or lines because the oil cooler is not armored on the backside. So it's not perfect, but I don't know of a World War II fighter with a better protected oil cooler. I'll go into this plane's armor protection at another time. If we look at almost any other non-turbocharged fighter of World War II, we see that it uses an air scoop to provide ram air into the carb or into the supercharger, depending on the configuration. The air scoop causes drag, but you get enough back in power, so it's worth it. How much power does ram air give us? It's more than you might think. The P-51 Mustang has an alternate source of air in case its ram air inlet gets blocked somehow. This isn't a perfect apples to apples because when alternate air is sourced in the 51, it not only loses the ram air pressure, the intake air temperature rises as well because the source of air is in the engine compartment. With ram air, the 51 can maintain 1,595 horsepower all the way up to 17,000 feet. Without ram air, it can only maintain that power level up to 11,700 feet. That's quite a big difference. Ram air means that the forward motion of the airplane rams the air into the carb or into the supercharger inlet and raises the pressure, in either case, at the supercharger inlet. The effect starts to become measurable at about 80 miles per hour, at which point it will cause a pressure buildup of about 1/10 of a psi. However, at 300 miles per hour, it's 1.6 psi, and that's very significant, and of course it's higher at higher speeds. To put that into perspective, a typical Fw-190A5 at its maximum power setting of 1.42 ATA has about 6 pounds of boost at sea level. So that 1.6 psi at 300 miles per hour is 27% of a 190A5's total boost. Of course, in a World War II airplane, the ram effect doesn't actually increase the manifold pressure because in most cases, that's regulated to some maximum value. Let's say it's 6 psi. What it does do is something that people have a hard time getting their head wrapped around. Remember that Mustang chart? Here it is again. So we're going to go over this in a slower, logical way. Notice that with or without ram air, at war emergency power, maximum power is 1,595 horsepower either way. So the ram air does not add peak horsepower. What the ram air pressure is doing is allowing that manifold pressure to be reached at a lower supercharger speed or lower throttle setting. Thus, without ram, the throttle is fully open at 11,700 feet, and nothing more can be done to increase manifold pressure and maintain that power without switching supercharger speeds. Or if you're in a Corsair or something, you could engage a second stage. Now, with ram air, the throttle is still partially closed at this point, and it's making full power at 11,700 feet, and as the aircraft keeps climbing, the throttle opens more and more until it's fully open at 17,000 feet. You can also think of this another way if it helps. A supercharger doesn't really create a specific amount of boost. In other words, your supercharger is not set to give 6 psi, for example. Instead, at a given rotational speed, it will create a pressure ratio, and that will equal some amount of boost under given conditions. We'll use a pressure ratio of 1.5 to 1 as an example. So if the outside air pressure is 14.7 psi, which is what it is at sea level in the standard atmosphere, it will multiply that 14.7 by 1.5 and give us 22 psi of absolute manifold pressure, thus about 7 pounds of boost. We call that 7 pounds of boost because it's 7 pounds above ambient. Now, if we don't change anything, our supercharger is still geared to give us that 1.5 to 1 ratio, but now we add in 1.6 psi of ram air. Well, now we have 14.7 plus 1.6 for a total of 16.3 psi at the supercharger inlet before the supercharger does anything. Now we multiply that by 1.5 and we have about 24.5 psi of absolute manifold pressure. That's an extra 2.5 pounds of boost, or about 5 inches of mercury. That works out to 0.17 ATA in the metric or German terms. For no additional, and you get that for no additional cost in terms of supercharger drive power requirements. This is the closest thing to free horsepower you're going to get, and that's the reason essentially every airplane uses ram air, and many cars use it as well. Although the effect is minimal at normal road speeds, the effect is normally about equal to the filter losses. So you can use ram air to kind of offset the filter loss in automotive intake design. But that's a whole nother topic. So back to the 190. Well, what about it? There are no visible intake scoops on it anywhere. Why not, when it was so standard on World War II fighters? Well, Focke-Wulf did design a cowl for it with dual supercharger intake scoops, one on each side. This picture of it is present in both the 190A5 and 190A8 manuals. However, I haven't seen a single picture of this cowling on an actual airplane. Every air-cooled 190 I have seen runs this cowling. As you can see, it takes in air for the supercharger on both sides of the cowling, just aft of the fan. That's the reason you see those 2 blisters on the side of the cowling in every 190A picture you can find. The manual actually explains this. As we discussed earlier, the fan creates meaningful positive pressure in the engine compartment, and thus the inlets in the cowl are under positive pressure all the time as long as the engine's spinning at high speed, even when the plane is at very low air speeds. The Focke-Wulf manual states that in testing, the cowling with internal ducts proved superior at all altitudes below the rated altitude of the engine. That means that the internal ducts performed better below about 6,500 meters, which is about 21,000 feet. At least that's how I'm translating it. I have the image up here so our German friends can post in the comments in case my translation's bad, but I don't think it is. This paragraph is found in this section of the 190A5 manual. I sent that out to all Patreons, so a lot of you should have it. So I guess it makes sense. They went with the internal ram air ducting arrangement because that configuration provided better performance in the altitude range in which the plane was intended to operate. I suspect that the reason the external setup worked better up at very high altitudes is because up there indicated airspeed and thus parasite drag is very low. So having something extra hanging off the plane isn't as big a deal in terms of drag as it is down low when indicating 350 miles per hour, which is 563 kph. So far we've discussed the cowling because it's a big part of what makes the 190 different. They used a fan so they could use a smaller inlet area to cool the engine, incorporated a ring-type oil cooler which adds essentially zero drag, and eliminated the external supercharger ram air inlets. There were also some cooling tricks on the engine itself which helped here, but I'll cover those when I get to the engine in another episode. There's just too much to unpack there to fit into this video. Besides the cowling, parasite drag was kept down by using a relatively small wing for the weight of the airplane. This high wing loading has some drawbacks, but it does reduce drag at high speeds, and that's what we're talking about right now. Then we have the steeply raked windshield and the partially retractable tail wheel I mentioned earlier. At the time of the 190's debut, most fighters had fixed tail wheels, so this was an advantage for the 190. Now it's time to calculate the drag. I'm going to use a 190A5, primarily because I need numbers for it in an upcoming episode anyway. I'm going to be comparing it to the Spitfire Mark IX. I'm not going to walk through all the calculations. I do that and fully explain it in other videos. I'll link them in the description. I do not have the ability to calculate drag the way David Lednicer did it in that EAA article. He's a real deal aerodynamicist by profession and approached this from that standpoint. I'm a pilot and former flight engineer, so I look at this stuff in a very different way. I essentially calculate it backwards with known data from the aircraft, like speed and thrust. We're going to take the top speed of the aircraft at sea level. This is always a bit sketchy as no two tests show the same numbers, but in this case, a 190A5, 350 miles per hour is very reasonable. One test had it slightly faster, 352 miles an hour. One was 346. I'm going with 350. It's not only a good compromise, it's a round number and it's easy to work with. Now we need to figure out how much power the plane is making at that speed. I'm converting all of this stuff to US horsepower numbers in advance, so these numbers may be slightly different than the PS numbers you typically see published, but not much different. The A5 puts out 1,627 horsepower at sea level. We figure in an 85% efficient propeller, and we're down to 1,383 horsepower. That prop efficiency number is from Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators. It's not 190 specific, but it's the best I can do. Now we convert that 1,383 horsepower to thrust at 350 miles per hour, and we get 1,478 pounds of thrust. But wait, there's more thrust from the exhaust, and it's significant. We can't forget that. Shockingly, it's published in the 190A8 manual, which is close enough here. At 1.42 ATA and at sea level, the 190's exhaust thrust adds 154 pounds for a total of 1,632 pounds of thrust. Thus, we know that at 350 miles per hour, we have 1,632 pounds of drag because thrust has to equal drag. Now, of course, this isn't perfect. The math formulas are, but as I said, the test data isn't perfect. Are we really sure about the plane's horsepower numbers, which are published, or the published top speed at sea level? Not to mention the prop efficiency is just an educated guess. That could easily be off 3% or so, and I'll discuss how these things could affect the results as we move on. Of course, we need the speed for the aircraft's L/D max. That's just not published anywhere for this airplane. Often we can figure it out by looking for the best glide speed, best range speed, or something else that happens at L/D max. But no such luck with the 190. I went with 175 miles per hour here, since that's what it is for the P-47, and that was the closest plane I could find in terms of wing loading, stall speeds, climb speeds. Those two planes are in the same ballpark anyway for those numbers. I then did the same for the Spitfire. The Spit Mark 9 I used did 336 miles per hour at sea level in testing. Now I have to say, every time I mention the Spitfire, somehow I get angry comments. I'm not saying this is the ultimate Spitfire variant. We're not comparing airplanes here per se. We're looking at drag, and this is the Spitfire I'm using for the drag comparison. Yes, I know there were faster Spitfires out there. However, this one is a Mark 9, which is a good version. The data is from a British test, and it's of a very lightly loaded plane with no ammo. Now, we need the speed for L/D max. Thankfully, that coincides with best range speed, which is in the manual. The speed is even at a lightweight, which matches up well with our top speed numbers. So far, so good. Power numbers were easy to find. Exhaust thrust wasn't. I often see published numbers for Merlin exhaust thrust at about 70 horsepower. I don't think that's right for a Merlin at maximum power. NACA has a test of an Allison-powered P-51 that shows its exhaust thrust at 336 miles per hour being about 9% of the propeller's thrust. However, for our purposes, it's not a perfect test. The Allison is not quite a Merlin. They're very similar. At least the single supercharged versions were very similar. And they tested the plane in a dive, thus it was not at maximum power. The 190's manual shows it has about 10% of its total thrust from exhaust at sea level and at 350 miles per hour. I went with an exhaust thrust number for the Merlin of 7% of engine power, which is 114 pounds of thrust, and added it to the engine thrust from the same formula for Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators and the same propeller efficiency of 85%. I graphed it all, and here's what we have. Pounds of drag are on the left side of the chart. The bottom numbers are miles per hour. Total drag for the Spitfire is the yellow line. Total drag for the 190 is the light blue line. So those are the ones we're primarily concerned with. So yes, I don't think there's any question that a 190A5 has less drag than a Spitfire Mark 9. Now I know someone will point out that I guessed at the exhaust thrust of the Merlin. True, but I intentionally went low with that 7% number. I'm very certain it's higher, which would increase the Spitfire's total drag, as that would mean it took more thrust to reach that 336 miles per hour. Prop efficiency, another variable, and admittedly that 85% is a best guess, although it is an educated guess. It's out of Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators. However, I don't think that using 85% for both airplanes favors the 190, as I seriously doubt the 190 has a more efficient propeller than the Spitfire. The bottom line here is that I'm being very conservative in regards to total drag for the Spit. The actual gap is probably a bit bigger. Of course, at the far left side of the chart, things change a bit. Notice the 190's line ends at 125. That's because it can't fly at 100 miles per hour with the flaps up. Its stall speed is well above that. Thus, the Spitfire's big wing gives it the edge in low-speed flying and in induced drag. At low speeds, the Spitfire has less total drag because at those speeds, induced drag makes up the majority of total drag. At high speed, of course, induced drag in any plane is minimal, which is why the induced drag lines for both planes are so close up there. I was actually surprised to see the induced drag is so close down at 125 miles per hour. And in retrospect, I think that's because the best glide speed I use for the 190 is a bit too low. I used 175 for reasons I explained a moment ago, which is why the induced and parasite drag lines, of course, cross at that point. I used 170 for the Spitfire. I'm sure the Spitfire's number there is correct. It's right out of the manual. But I'm thinking the 190's is too low. Shifting that crossover to the right to 185 or so would show a bigger gap in induced drag favoring the Spitfire. I'm going to have to do more research to get a better idea of what the best glide speed is in the 190. It seems the Germans never published that for World War II fighters, so it's a bit of a problem to figure it out. This will matter when we start looking at maneuverability in another episode, so I have to get it cleared up by then. However, I want to be very clear about this. Moving the best glide speeds, and thus the crossover point, will have zero effect on total drag at high speed. Thus, for purposes of this video, it doesn't matter. Any way I run the numbers, that 190A5 has less total drag at high speeds than that Spitfire Mark 9. I think that's really impressive for a radial engine fighter. I want to thank all my subscribers and especially my Patreon supporters. You folks make this all possible. In preparation for this video, I sent all Patreon members access to a drive with the full 500 plus page Fw-190A5 manual, as well as the 190 F3 supplement. The F3 was the up-armored ground attack version of the A5. This matters because we'll be discussing the F3 a bit in an upcoming episode on the 190's BMW radial. The reason is the F3 had C3 injection, which is particularly interesting. I also included the full BMW 801 engine manual and quite a bit more. I'll be adding more information to the drive, and the update will go out in late December. There's one more thing I want to talk about. It's not worth making a video about this, but I feel I have to cover it, so I'm just going to tack it on here. I have received a number of questions from people wanting my opinion on the F-35. I've probably had about 10 questions on this in the last month, which is a little bit surprising to me since I don't do much modern jet stuff on this channel, a little bit. I'll share what I know, but I'm really the wrong person to ask about it. I think somehow I've inadvertently given the impression that I'm an ex-military pilot. I certainly haven't ever said that. I don't think I've ever implied it. So I think this comes from the fact that I use so many military sources in my video. Aerodynamics for naval aviators, for example, plus a lot of books on naval aviation tactics. I was never in the military. I wanted to go in, that's another story. I started flying when I was 17. I've had many aviation jobs. I worked as a flight instructor and as an air traffic reporter back when that was an actual job. I have worked for 6 airlines. The first one went out of business. The second was a dead end career-wise, so I left it. The third went out of business. The fourth went out of business. The fifth was a crappy job, but in this career, you have to stay current, so I had to take the job. I only worked there for a short time at that 5th airline. So now I'm at airline number 6. I've been here about 10 years. I'm captain on a 767. I fly all over the world. It's a decent job. Certainly not the best job in aviation, but it's decent, and I actually really love it. I have flown some World War II stuff, but no fighters. Nothing that would be all that exciting to my viewers, which is why I haven't talked about it. For example, a Piper Cub, which was used as a primary trainer during the war. Still one of my favorite airplanes I've ever flown. I've flown the Stearman, which was heavily used as a trainer during the period. Honestly, I was kind of disappointed in the Stearman. I thought it would have a lot more performance than it did. I flew a 220 horsepower version, and I think a Cessna 172 far outperforms it, and I don't really like the 172, as I've talked about before. I've flown a C-54, and it was built in 1944, so that's legitimately a World War II airplane. I'm proud to say that the very same C-54 I flew participated in the Berlin airlift and in Iran-Contra. Of course, I flew it after those events, but not much after Iran-Contra. I think it was 88 or 89 when I flew that. Sadly, I have little time in that plane. Back then, while I did like historical airplanes, I was at a phase in my life when I was a young man seriously focused on moving my career along, and that meant getting into something turbine-powered. In retrospect, I do wish I would have flown that C-54 a lot more. Plus, the captain on the plane was a really interesting guy. So my point here is that I was never in the military, thus my knowledge of modern jets is really limited to stuff that's no longer in service and is fully declassified. That means I know next to nothing about the F-35. However, I do fly with co-pilots all the time who are either ex-military or who currently fly in the National Guard and have flown the newer warplanes, and some of them like to talk about them, and of course, I kind of encourage that because I like to talk about airplanes. I've even flown with some B-2 pilots, and sometimes I think I might know more about the B-2 than I really should. I recently flew with an F-15C pilot who also has flown the F-22. So here's what I'm hearing about the F-35 from people who do know. I run into two very different schools of thought from these ex-military and current Guard pilots. One group argues that the F-35 represents another failed attempt to be a jack of all trades and is thus master of none. These types tend to be older pilots who say that an F-15 or an F-16 will turn an F-35 into scrap metal with ease. But there's another group, and these tend to be younger folks. Tend to be. It's not 100% either way. But this group strongly disagrees and says that the anti-F-35 crowd is looking at it through a prism of the past and simply don't understand the airplane. They argue that in actual combat it's going to be used in such a new and different way that the old-time planes are not going to know what hit them. I don't know what they're talking about because, again, it's a highly classified airplane, so I have no way to discern which school of thought has more validity here. Hence, I have no idea about how good or poor the F-35 is. As with most things, time will tell. Thanks so much, and I hope everyone is having a great day. Goodbye.